Sagar and Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. We have an amazing episode for everybody. It is with Alex Kantrowitz, our friend over from the Big Technology newsletter. Why? Because we had to react to the news of Twitter. I know it might seem like slightly old news at this point, even though it's only been less than a week, but Jack is out, Parag Agarwal is in, new policies are being announced. What the hell does it all mean for the future of the internet, journalism? I mean, the way that we all discourse with one another online. There's a lot that we get into today, Marshall.
Yeah, the other thing we covered, really, aside from a conversation around the future of the internet, the usual stuff we all know you enjoy, was Frances Haugen. She testified again. This is the Facebook whistleblower. And in Alex's reporting and some tweets he put out, he was acknowledging and just referencing the fact that that coverage and that testimony had basically zero impact. When, if you look at how big of a story the Facebook whistleblowing was supposed to be in August, the fact that it's making no impact whatsoever says a lot about the space, says a lot about how this issue is now being much more partisan. People were talking about, when they were covering the issue, of how this time when she testified, Republicans were much, much more aggressive towards her, because it turns out that whether you like her or not, a lot of the points she's advancing, especially the ones outside of the Instagram research with young girls, that one's pretty nonpartisan. You could take them either direction. But a lot of the stuff was more focused on content moderation. Those are obviously points that align more with like what the Democratic Party wants. So this was just another good opportunity for us to once again hit everyone over the head with the idea that there is no actual bipartisan consensus on tech. And if you act like there is, you're going to have a really bad time. Dan Crenshaw said it himself. Dems want one thing. Ours want one thing. Probably going to have to pick a side if this is this you care about.
Yeah, good. So you're going to get a lot of good analysis. We have some debates, some discussion, and more about how the future is, whether tech can even be regulated, and what that all looks like. I think you'll enjoy it.
And just, of course, have to shout out a couple of things. It's the holiday season. So our bookshop is moving books. It's actually really exciting. Sagar, homework for the two of us. We need to put together our 10 books of the year. We really enjoyed Peace. People really liked that. Moved a lot of copies last week. So go to the bookshop, check out Alex's book, check out other authors' books, but we will also put together our own list. Number 2, check out our Substack going out on Thursdays as well. Finally, thank you to Lincoln Network for supporting the show. Let's get into the episode. Alex Kantrowitz, good friend of the show. Welcome back to the Realignment.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and congrats to you both on an amazing 2021. I've been binging the show, and I think it's your best year yet, and bravo.
Means a lot, dude. Thank you.
What's funny is it's year 3 for us. So basically, if every year isn't the best year yet for all of us in any context, it's kind of a really devastating reality here. But speaking of good years, you've done an amazing job with reporting and just telling the broader story of tech. So let's start with the most newsily obvious implication bit here. Let's talk about Jack Dorsey and Twitter. Obviously, this is airing on Tuesday, so we're a little behind the news cycle here. But what's the state of play? Like, what happened? Why did this matter? And let's get your broad thoughts on what this means going forward.
It's actually kind of fascinating, because you never think that Jack would leave Twitter voluntarily. The man obviously loved being the CEO of Twitter. So it's been clear that he's been fairly withdrawn, though, over the past year. And I think there might be a few reasons to that, which have been broadly discussed, and I think they're fairly accurate. The first is that he got so attracted to Bitcoin and became obsessed with it and couldn't even think about anything else. And the second is that he had activist shareholders. Elliott Management came in, basically called for his removal, and set this thing in motion about a year ago. And so you add those things together, something new that he was obsessed about, shareholders that want him out. And my reporting, had me understand that Jack was spending less than 10% of his time at Twitter. He's basically, a ghost there. I had people tell me that he wasn't, even participating in his own Slack channel where people asked him questions, where he used to be, pretty active. And so it all culminated with him deciding to step down. So yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting to see Twitter without Jack. It's surprising, although not that shocking, given everything that had been building, for the past couple of years.
Let's disaggregate this a little bit, because Twitter can be a very emotional conversation for people. Let's talk about Twitter as a business. What was the case for removing Jack as the CEO of Twitter from a purely business perspective? As in, why did Elliott Management and a lot of other people want Jack to go? Why did they not think that he was innovating on the product, leadership, all of that? And then we'll get into the more political implications.
The Elliott Management move to me has been one of the more confounding parts of this whole thing. I know Twitter has underperformed the S&P 500 since Jack has taken over, but the context within which he took over was that Twitter was a mess. The business was going nowhere. It was stagnating users. And he made a lot of bold moves in order to bring it back from the brink of irrelevance. Talk about what happened underneath him. The algorithm, it was applied to the feed underneath Jack. The resumption of daily active user growth happened under him as the CEO. After it had declined. By the way, before Twitter, there was rarely, I think if ever, a large consumer social media company that started to grow users after losing them, and Twitter became the first.
Wow.
I think that expanding tweets from 140 characters to 280 was another big important move that Jack made that brought value to the service. I think you saw the depth of conversation expand under that. I think he has done some bold experiments. For instance, like asking people whether they want to read before they retweet something, click the link before you spread it. So that's been good. And so for Elliott to come in after he, came in and made all these changes from the very beginning, he said, we're going to question all the fundamentals. It used to be you could never touch that feed with an algorithm. It used to be that you could never think about changing the character count, and he blew that stuff up. And I think overall had Twitter headed in a good direction. So come in as an activist investor and say he's done a poor job with the business, to me, was something that you might do if you were a pure numbers person and didn't have a real understanding of how Twitter, the business, worked.
Can we get to the obvious bit here? And this is where I'll do my best Scott Galloway impression. You just said he was spending 10% of his time. And at best, it was going to be spending 50% of his time. So isn't there just this basic argument that everything you're describing were some really good 2015, 2016, 2017 calls, but by just late 2020, when it came to the need to compete with Clubhouse, RIP, when it came to the need to actually launch Twitter Blue, it was the activist investing that actually drove those business side. How do we get to the next stage part of it? What do you think about that part?
So I think that the activist investor came in and that did light a fire under Twitter's product organization, right? So it did spark Twitter Spaces, which essentially put Clubhouse out of business. It did spark Twitter Blue, which is now aligning Twitter user interest with product interest because we're not paying for it. That's the premium subscription. So I think that, the activist investor did spark some good things, no doubt about it. Twitter usually moves at a glacial pace. But I also think it ground Jack Dorsey's, interest in being there into the ground. And so, because they came in sort of like a wrecking ball and said, get out of here. And ultimately it might have been, almost too successful for its own good, where it did push, this product movement, but also got Jack out of the business. Again, I don't know, I happen to think Jack was pretty good at doing the job. And so, ultimately he obviously either lost interest or was told he needed to leave. And so that's why he's no longer CEO of Twitter. It was very strange from Twitter. Twitter usually has these long deliberative, exit periods for its CEO. Jack was just like, I'm out of here. And Parag's the new CEO. We're done. So it all happened, pretty quickly.
It's interesting too. Yeah, Alex, I was saying this and you and I were talking, all three of us probably were talking about this, is, when they named an engineer to the former CTO to the position, I was kind of blown away. And I was talking, with you and with Marshall, because I don't see any engineering problems that Twitter has. And I can already see the SV guys rolling their heads. But as you said, rolling out Twitter Blue is not that hard. A pretty basic MBA can order an engineer and be like, build a subscription product. Okay. Twitter Spaces, same thing. Social audio, all of that. You just have to link it to the to your actual Twitter account, Revu, the newsletter business. All of that actually did happen underjack. Now, you could make the case then that the activists are the ones who lit the fire. But once again, like, these are not major innovations that need to happen. They have a multi-billion-dollar business because they have a shitload of people on their platform, and they basically just need to keep them there. Not that difficult. But it seems to me that by choosing an engineer, they are really not reckoning with the fact that the biggest company decisions that they're going to have to make in the next, 3 to 4 years are all political. I mean, his very first day, Parag Agrawal greenlights one of the dumbest policies that I've seen yet in terms of private people, obviously influenced by like an activist class. He's going to have to decide whether Trump comes back or not in 2023 if he decides to run for president. He is going to have to decide the bar for election claims and stuff, both in 2022 and in 2024. In other words, like, all of the major questions that he's going to face have nothing to do with engineering. I'm curious am I the only person who thinks this? What was the mindset behind choosing somebody like this? And what are the pitfalls in the future?
And quick thing, Alex, can you explain what the private photo decision was for folks? Like, what was that for? What was that for first? Like, what was that decision? And then get into Sagar's question there.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that first because it really gets into the nature of how Twitter operates as a business. So there was a policy that Twitter released this week, and basically in day one of Parag Agrawal's tenure as CEO, that says if you post a photo of a private individual or video of a private individual, that's against Twitter's rules, and they'll take it down if they complain. This is crazy because, some of the most newsworthy stuff on Twitter is of private individuals. And now Twitter did, make a couple of caveats. So I have the Twitter safety tweets up here. So they say context matters. Our existing private information policy includes many exceptions in order to enable robust reporting on newsworthy events and conversations that are in the public interest, which essentially says we're going to basically turn this over arbitrarily to our content moderators who are going to take it on a case-by-case basis, and we'll have no consistency, on the policy. It's an absurd policy. It's a terrible policy. And it shows up on Parag's first day. The thing that's worth noting about Twitter is,
one more thing, Alex.
Yeah.
What is the steelman good? Why are they doing this policy?
There's a lot of there are some reasons that you wouldn't want this stuff to happen. So, for instance, let's say you have a rape victim, and this is a real case. We have a rape victim, and their photo is put on Twitter, and they start getting harassed. You can put someone's phone number on. That's doxing against the private
but those
information.
Are already against Twitter rules, right?
Yeah,
both the cases you just laid out are already against the rules.
Yeah, well, but there was no rule for photos. And images.
Right. Yeah, fair enough.
So that's the steelman argument for it. But again, it's a ridiculous policy because it can, phone number is very clear. That's a phone number. When it comes to putting images of private individuals, Sagar, you mentioned this week, what about the George Floyd situation? And Twitter says, okay, it has to be reported by the first party, but we already know that that's not happening. And there's some amazing cases. I think the folks who were out in Charlottesville for that white nationalist rally are like, oh, well, let's rally around this policy and get all the images that are
can I stop you there? This is important, Alex. The very first person I saw this enforced against was against somebody who is some Black Lives Matter activist trying to expose Andy Ngo for hanging out with some right-wing. By the way, this is no judgment. I don't know if any of this is true. But anyway, his tweets on the subject were taken down as a result of this policy because the people that he was trying to connect Andy Ngo with, some Polish right-wing activists, they complained and they got this thing taken down. And this guy is a journalist, the person who did this.
So I will say that oftentimes it is the woke folks that are pushing for these policies. I don't think that was the case here. But it is, there is just elements of the woke side of social media that want more stuff taken down. So ban the Nazis is the catch-all for banning everybody they don't like. So, but here, I just want to make one point about this, and it's sort of important, which is that Twitter is not traditionally not a centrally led organization. It's basically a bunch of different autonomous organizations, under the banner of one company. So the idea that this policy, comes out on Parag's first day, it really wasn't one of his initiatives. It was something that was percolating within the company for a while and then, gets released on his first day. I think the problem is And this is where it shows exactly the issue with what you're talking about, Sagar, is that he didn't have the wherewithal to either pause this and let him get his sea legs before, you have a big content moderation policy, especially it's such a bad one like this, be released on his first day. He didn't have the wherewithal to say, hey, maybe we should pause this before, and before people want to define me, because it is a defining moment. This is your first day, man. And leadership is saying, how are people going to view the company underneath what I'm doing? Very poor leadership. Or at the very least, and this is what I called for this week, the man should have released a statement talking about what his view is on speech.
Yes.
He did nothing. He said nothing. And he allowed his previous statements, which have been picked apart, fairly so, to speak for him. Come on, man. You were the CTO of the company. You weren't dealing with this stuff. If people are going to have faith in your leadership to run what is an extremely political tech company, you need to come out in day one, or at least week one, and say, this is my view on speech. There's been nothing of the case. And so it's a massive stumble in week one. And we're not going to judge the guy completely based off of what he does in his first 24 hours. But man, it was not very reassuring.
Man, Alex, when you said it's not day one, I thought of the Peter Griffin Family Guy segment where he's like, he said it, always day one.
Yeah.
Alex is incredible. If you're listening to the audio version, Alex is really, really good book on how tech companies work. And this is why we keep citing and bringing you on, because the thing we see, the biggest problem when it comes to tech reporting, especially when it's political people looking at tech, is they don't understand how structural these things are. So for me, when I look at Twitter, there's a lot of people on the right who are like, oh, like Twitter, like you said, like, oh, it's always like woke people are doing all these things. It's like, it's actually much more complicated than that, because that suggests there's a plan. That suggests that there is this like top down, like woke censorship, which that's not actually it. What's actually happening is there's all these decentralized, not particularly aligned, sometimes contradictory things that are trying to come together. So just how are they thinking through the challenges Sagar is articulating here? So given what you just said, I don't have confidence that this team is going to sit down in 2023 and come and look, they're never going to make everyone happy here. I'm not saying that I expect them to come out and say, hey, we're run by the First Amendment, this, and that. They're not going to make anyone happy here. That's not the claim. But I don't think they're going to do anything. And that's what leads to New York Post Hunter Biden style situations where they have no plan. Someone's on vacation. This team says one thing, this team says. So can you just help us understand how these weird segments are going to like work over the next few years when it comes to these big questions?
Yeah, Marshall. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It always comes down to culture. And Del Harvey, who is the head of trust and safety at Twitter, controversial, but at least had some vision about how the thing should work. She left too. So she's gone. Jack's gone.
Interesting.
And what do you have? It's a mess. And Twitter's always a mess organizationally. I mean, it's sort of, I think Mark Zuckerberg had the best explanation of it, where he said it was a clown car. They drove a clown car into a gold mine, which is honestly the best description you can have of Twitter. But I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to get this stuff right. And I think that the concerns that you and Sagar bring up about having a CTO take over a company that is a political animal are legitimate. I personally was astonished they didn't put the head of product, Kayvon Beckipor, in charge of the thing. I had him on Big Technology Podcast a couple of months ago, and he made a really great point, which is that Twitter had a new head of product every year, and he stayed there for 4 years. And that's another reason, along with the activist investors, that you're starting to see them ship. So it's going to be a challenging couple of years for them, and I do see things getting worse at Twitter before they get better.
Let me ask you this, Alex. I'm not a genius. It took me a single second to look at that policy and business. I was like, edge case, edge case, edge case, edge case. Is there nobody inside the room who is thinking about this, or at least articulating it in the proper way? And I'm not just talking about this policy specifically. I mean, are they truly that clueless to the role that they play in the shape of the not just American, global news media?
Yeah.
And to not have the wherewithal to understand that and its impact has bit them in the ass so many times now that it's like, at what point do you wake up and say, we need to have a policy consistency. Just think about this for what immediately I was like George Floyd, Philando Castile, Kyle Rittenhouse. I've named like 6 different ones. I'm like, which one stay? Amy Goodman. I'm like, which one stays up? Which one stays down?
Well, Sagar, we know well, but this is why it's toxic.
By the way, I already know the answer.
Well, that's the problem. We know that these things are all.
No, but that's my point. So it's like, okay, it's like, so you're going to take down one video and you're going to keep this? I'm like, that's crazy.
It is. Yeah. And Twitter is extremely so I would say, first of all, Twitter is an extremely reactive organization. There's no proactive planning there. And that did follow the personality of Jack Dorsey. I mean, the man wasn't exactly like a bold leader. He was kind of like, okay, chill, Yeah. So we'll see if that changes under Parag. I don't think it will, but we'll see. I mean, hold on. There were some amazing quotes. The Washington Post had this story about Parag that was unbelievable, where people were talking about his leadership. I just wrote about it. Give me a second. I'll pull up the quotes. Sure. I mean, it was totally absurd what people were saying about this guy. I mean, talk about someone who you don't have faith in. Here are 3 quotes. He's the best choice among a bunch of bad options. 2, isn't the best with people. 3, I've seen worse men get ahead with less. I mean, come on. This was the guy that was universally approved by the board, and we had this big push to get rid of Jack Dorsey, and this is the person. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to give him some time, but it doesn't seem promising. And, I want to talk a little bit about what you said, your point, Sagar, about was there nobody in the room? And it almost feels like, like you get to the end of a school year and you get a substitute teacher and the kids know they kind of have to work on the schoolwork, but they don't really give a shit about, what they're doing. And I kind of think that that's what it is, where Jack is there 10% of the time. Del Harvey is left, head of trust and safety. And now get this, the head of communications at Twitter also left after, I don't know how long she was there, maybe, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, wow. Something like that. So think about this. Absent CEO, I guess head of trust and safety is gone. No head of comms. That's how something like this gets shipped out. I mean, but you would also think the people who are like shipping it probably should say, hey, can we check with the new CEO and see if he wants, us to put this out as it is? The fact that it wasn't reviewed or wasn't intervened with before it went out to me is totally absurd, because it just gives ammo to everybody, all your worst critics who want to see, their view of the world sort of, pushed forward with the policy. So.
And I just want to hit something super important here. None of us, aside from the specific critique of the way the policies are implementing, our critique is really about the structure here. Mm-hmm. This isn't even really about the exact decision that was come to. It's like, whoa, like whether this is like left, right, center, neutral, this is not good. I want to pivot us a bit to another newsy tech thing. The last thing I'll say on this is, I don't think anything we're saying should give anyone any confidence about a world where Donald Trump is more likely than not going to re-enter the political arena in some degree in 2023. I think that should be the number one thing that's on everybody's mind. But let's talk about Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. You had a tweet which tweeted out a Politico story where it was just noting she testified yesterday and nobody noticed this. And I think it's really funny because we've also talked about this where I praised Scott Galloway earlier. I'll dunk on Scott Galloway. There was an episode of Pivot recently where he was like, I think Frances Haugen is going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think that Frances Haugen is going to be Times Woman of the Year. And maybe Scott's just performing. He's been on the show. I like Scott. But the fact that there's an audience that is receptive to that idea shows how completely this Facebook discourse has gone off the rails of what is actually happening in reality. So I'd just love to hear you reflect on basically the rise and fall and irrelevance of Frances in this context.
Yeah, there's so many different factors that might have led to it. But yeah, people were telling me, oh, Alex, it's been a busy news week. Look at this new coronavirus variant. I'm like, no one gives a shit about this coronavirus variant. I mean, we're paying attention, but it's not anything close to like what the original wave was or Delta. There's definitely room in the news cycle. So I wouldn't explain that as the reason why no one's paying attention to Frances anymore. Okay, let me caveat before I explain why I think she's fallen out of the news cycle. I still think that there's a chance that some of the documents that she's put out there are going to actually lead to consequences. And they're with the SEC right now. They're with Congress. Sometimes this takes a long time. So I wouldn't write off what she's done completely, but it's definitely not a buzzy news story anymore. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. Number one is that Facebook scandal has become so commonplace to the point that it's now kind of boring. Where it's like, the one thing that people said after all these revelations came out, we saw all the internal documents, all the internal conversations. People were just kind of like, okay, well, we knew that. And, the reason was because, we've had this reporting on this and scandal after scandal, one after the other. And basically there's no bad thing you could tell us about Facebook anymore that would really make us, pay attention for more than a day or two, because it's been, that exposed in the media for the bad things it does. The other thing is that I think, Haugen, from a political, perspective, has been somewhat unconvincing. She's come out there with a handful of different policy solutions and tried to, help guide the discussion of what should happen next to Facebook. And it doesn't seem like any of it will actually really, improve, will solve some of the problems that we're seeing with Facebook. A lot of people have said it's been a little too friendly to Facebook as a company. For instance, like, having an agency that would help monitor Facebook's, staffed by former Facebook people. Who does that help entrench? Typically it's Facebook. And there's been some of the other stuff. She's potentially undermined herself a little bit politically by allying with folks like Pierre Omidyar.
That's the founder of eBay, who's a very, very big liberal donor.
Exactly. And kind of, working with former Obama staffers. If it was me, I would potentially, even though this is a political thing, I would be as apolitical as possible, and align myself with a different PR firm, different backers.
Right. But here's the problem. Mm-hmm. If you're apolitical, then there's no reason to do what she did. Right.
Yeah. It is a catch-22.
Well, no, because once again, like there's an apolitical way to say, look, I think Facebook's up to sketchy shit. I'm gonna be a whistleblower and release a bunch of documents. Like that does not have to be the framing and what there has to be political.
Well, the reason that she, according to her, the reason that she came out was because she thought it was causing social strife, which is code for. And I don't think, look, I've listened to a lot of the people who have interpreted her work, and it seems overwhelmingly, absent like maybe one or two, it is being used to push obvious, like a censorship regime. And I think that that's what her ideal was. I mean, she's essentially what she's come out and said. Facebook does need to be regulated. They don't have the best interests. For all of the maybe one or two stories that came out about Instagram and, teen girls and internal studies, I'm not whitewashing them, not saying it isn't important, but that is not what, according to her, why she decided to leave the company and then leak all of these documents. So I just think that it was obviously an inherent political act from the very beginning, for the reason putting all of this stuff out. And it was done for a very specific reason. I mean, Alex, do you disagree? I'm curious. Like, that's my read of the situation. Maybe I'm just really cynical.
Yeah, I haven't personally seen it be this move to censor more stuff. That hasn't been my read on it. But I also don't fully see a coherent. I would have loved to have seen a coherent platform from her if she was going out and she's almost kind of living in this weird middle where she's pointing out some of the problems. She has some half-baked solutions, and she's speaking with Congress and the SEC and trying to get them to, take it the rest of the way. And I don't think you can trust those entities.
Let's talk about these solutions, actually, because this is important. I've actually been wanting to talk about this for a while. I heard Tristan Harris on Joe Rogan's podcast.
That was a great show.
It was a good show.
Yeah.
It was important because it was a true clash of ideologies. Tristan is probably the best faith extension of Haugenism, if there is to be such a thing, which is
you just coined
algorithms.
The term.
Algorithms are currently bad, but they don't have to be bad. They can be good. And to be good, it requires the government and social stuff to push things in that direction. What do you make of that reading of Haugen, which is that algorithms, technology, all of that don't inherently have to result in social strife and social lack of social cohesion. They can be re-engineered to a purpose. They can be pushed in the right direction by democracy, society, and all of that in the context of the current debate. Because, obviously I'm deeply skeptical of it because the people who most reacted to the Haugen news, Marshall, as you alluded to, are people who just want to screw over Facebook. And are people who want to like take control of the algorithm and blame the algorithm specifically for social problems, which basically are way more downstream of like way bigger problems than anything to do with technology itself.
Yeah, I think that you have to. I think that last point you made is the most important, which is that people do want to just blame Facebook for everything in our society, but you really have to look at our institutions first. If people have no faith in Congress, if people have no faith in the media, if people have no faith in business, then what's going to happen when they talk about it? You're going to see the mess you see on Facebook, where it's just basically conspiracy theories thrive, and yeah, they're trying to undercut everything that these institutions are doing. The institutions have to clean it up themselves first before we can start talking about the problems that Facebook is doing. And I do think that Haugenism is a little bit idealistic, although I wouldn't discount it completely. Like one of the things that I've loved about her leaks is that we're starting to see some of the experiments that Facebook has done on its feed and on its users, and getting a chance to dissect what they mean, and then think about the solutions. So there's two that I wrote about in big technology. One is sort of counter to what she wants, which was funny that it was in her documents that she leaked. I think that's good, actually, that all these got out there. So she's talking about how we should, potentially remove some Section 230 protections, which make the platforms not liable for stuff that are said by users on them when it comes specifically to what they recommend. And so essentially what it would be like is, when Facebook, if there's content on Facebook, Facebook's not liable. Once Facebook recommends it to you, then it is liable. And Facebook actually did this experiment where they wrote, where they for a percentage of users took an unranked feed and showed it to them, basically saying our algorithm isn't really going to apply. But what happened was with this unranked feed, more of a real-time feed, they had double the amount of integrity problems, and it was a mess. It was flooded with groups content. And Facebook was like, it's going to be even worse. So we keep the algorithm in. And so, it basically pushing Facebook forward to an unranked feed with legislation to me is obviously a bad outcome. Although there's arguments to be made that you could still do it. For instance, like you would maybe force Facebook to build the product from the bottom up again to try to make it happen. The other thing is the share button. So I've been a big proponent for rethinking the share button. I don't think that what's said on these platforms is the issue. I think you start to get into some problems when you have virality that just goes completely unchecked and incentivizes outrage. Most important, I think the outrage stuff is, to me, the biggest issue. I see Sagar's rolling his eyes, but
it's just like, who decides? Like,
this is my
this is the key thing, right?
Right,
like, and this is where you're not going to be happy, Sagar. They decide, like that's the like. So,
no,
like, someone is like.
So I'd rather it just be like this, like currently, instead of trying to regulate outrage. I mean, I just don't see how that works.
But here's the key. Here's the key thing. Alex gave a good example of something that people on the right dunk on, but actually I think it's largely fine. Did you read this or not? That is a definition of something which is content neutral, dials down like outrage retweet. What aside from, and actually, what's your beef with that policy? Because that is a good faith articulation of what rethinking sharing functions in neutral ways. And people on the right never say it's neutral. Body. But what's your critique of that?
I think COVID has just made me so incredibly black-pilled on the idea of neutrality, on the idea of any sort of good intention on when something is applied or not, on the ability to actually work the refs, that I would rather that it just be left alone. I mean, at the current, for example, like on the have you actually read this button? It doesn't apply in all cases. In my experience, I don't retweet as nearly as much as I used to, but in the few cases that I do, I think it's usually applied in the COVID case as opposed to like some random New York Times article. Now, maybe you agree with that, but once again, That is an editorial judgment. So they're going to apply the "did you read this thing" to every single thing that you retweet with a newspaper article? Okay, maybe. I would maybe support something like that. But as all three of us know, that's not actually going to happen because it would also decrease retweets, which would hurt their business. So then it becomes who puts it in one way and who for the other. The same thing like on virality. And this is why I'm really skeptical, Alex. I mean, I don't think the three of us would be here at all without the ability to go viral. I owe a lot of my early career to going viral. Now, look, maybe that's a selfish reason, but it didn't necessarily happen through outrage. It happened through wanting to contribute to the news cycle, wanting to produce something that I knew could be tangentially related to this, that people might also find interesting. So there are also a lot of downstream effects towards trying to crush virality, to crush sharing, and all of that. I just continue to come back to this. People are really pissed off for a variety of reasons. And I don't think almost any of it has to do with social media. I think people are really pissed because the price of gas is high and because they still have to wear a mask whenever they get on an airplane or whatever. Or if they don't see somebody wearing a mask, or because their kid is like sick at school and gets pulled out for like 19 days because of whatever their COVID policy is. Like, that's why you see the reflections in our tech. I just think that the effects of it are super marginal. Go ahead.
This is where I have to push back though, where look, Twitter, and once again, this is why Alex's frame is really helpful. Then I'll throw this to you, Alex, but Twitter has no control over anything you just like stated. Twitter has no control over Virginia public schools. Twitter has basically no one has control over fixing institutions. The only thing that Twitter can do, and the only thing that Twitter will be held accountable for, because this is like I'm putting myself in like a Twitter perspective. The only thing Twitter will be held accountable is there disinformation happening on their platform? I agree with you. I agree with you that like going through the Hunter Biden story, especially when it's in the New York Post, is a mistake. But I do think Twitter does have to think about. Let me put it this way. You cannot look at tech and virality and think that being neutral equals being neutral. That is a choice in of itself.
Yes.
You have to think about the way your algorithm is designed. And let's get real, man. Like, I get your point about like, you do not personally wake up every day thinking like, how can I like create outrage and like this or that. But dude, the stuff that goes like the most viral from your stuff, from our stuff, like there's a serious correlation with like not the hardest, most valuable news we're doing. But I'm just curious how you think about this, Alex.
Well, I want to be a little more precise. I feel like,
thank you.
I talked about outrage. Well, no, because on my statement, right, I talked about outrage and how I feel like that's an issue. And I think Sagar's right. There's lots of good forms of outrage. What I would like these platforms to be is more thoughtful and less emotional. I think that that's probably a good thing, especially given the way our society works and what happens when we spread stuff based off emotion. When we spread based off emotion, we spread misinformation. We spread stuff that exploits our identities, and we spread, the things that make us angriest, maybe not necessarily things we should be angriest about. And that's why I think that when you think about the share button, it enables all of that. And when you put some restrictions on the share buttons, it doesn't end virality. It just reshapes it. So even if they took it away completely, you'd still be able to spread things. You would just have to copy them and paste them and like maybe add your own take on it and put it under your own avatar. Whereas now you just hit retweet and next thing you know, someone else's avatar is right there in front of everybody that follows you. And you don't really have much accountability for sharing it, nor did you probably think too much about it before you pushed it.
But why should you? I guess that's the question, right? Like why? I like retweeting people. It's fun. Sometimes I didn't think about it, give credit to the person that did it. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's a really good point. And it's a way to be able to give credit. Like, why should I have to do the whole point of the internet is supposed to make it more frictionless, right?
Well,
that's
who decided?
Yeah.
Well, that was a conjecture. Well, but this is actually a really relevant pivot because what's so interesting here is I think a good way of summing up all of these problems is we never actually came to a consensus on what the internet is. If we take, like, let's say a centrist listener of the Realignment, a right-wing listener, a left-wing listener, they would have three different answers to what you just said, Sagar. Like, a libertarian would say, yeah, like, it is actually designed to be more frictionless, or it's designed to, like, decentralize and take down all these big institutions, versus, like, a left person would have a entirely different take. So how do we think about what this actually is, and how do we actually, as a society, come to those consensuses, because it doesn't seem like people are comfortable or happy with companies doing that, though that's the actual default here.
I think the internet is best when it exposes you to new ideas that you never would have seen before, by nature of the fact that it flattens our communication. I think the internet is at its worst when you have systems or bad actors that take advantage of its ability to expose you to those ideas and, intentionally play the system to get bad stuff in front of you. And so we talk about like the share button. And here's another one of Frances Haugen's documents that I found pretty interesting and also wrote up. So they have this thing called the Deep Reshare, which is, when you not when you share something, but when you share something that someone else has shared into your feed. So like 2 hops of a share, right? And when you have a deep reshare, so 38% of all views of misinformation take place after 2 reshares, according to Facebook. And then photos, the numbers are even higher, 65, and the 38% is links. For photos, it's 65% of all photo misinformation, take place after 2 reshares. And when you have a page, only 20% of their content is viewed at a deep reshare of 2 or higher. So I think that it tells us something. And I know we could go on for another whole show about how Facebook classifies misinformation.
Who decides?
That is an issue. I for sure. I think directionally though those numbers are telling. I think there are edge cases where you don't want Facebook making decisions, but directionally those numbers tell you that you can get exposed to lots of new interesting ideas at a depth of 1 reshare. When one of your friends sees something that's posted originally and shares it into your feed, we could generally say that that's good. But when one of your friends sees something that's shared into their feed by somebody else and then shares it into your feed, that's when we start getting into trouble. And personally, I would much rather have some controls on this virality to make sure that I end up seeing stuff that's informative to me, interesting, something that's a new idea, potentially taking on the establishment, not against that. But I think that we see the most constructive forms of shares happen after maybe 1 reshare from an original source or from an original source itself, versus something that's deep down on the virality chain. And I'm not saying necessarily stop reshares after 2, but I think that, and this is probably the good thing that Haugen's done, is bring some of this research out into, the public forum so that we can actually look at what's happening and have conversations about what the best way to approach it is. And, whether we want to do anything at all, but at least we're having the conversation.
I want to take us to the piece you released on Thursday of last week, which is the internet was once flat, no longer. I'd love for you to explain how the internet transforming from a big community into a variety of smaller communities is really upended all of these things. Because my quick editorial here, and I think you agree with this, Sagar, is the thing that brings together everything we're talking about today: Frances Haugen, Jack's transition, the lack of total regulatory changes during the Biden administration's first year, almost certainly going to go down from there. Is it seems like we've just reached a dead end when it comes to a lot of these conversations, and getting out of that impasse is going to require new conceptions of how the internet works, how these platforms works. Maybe that's why people are excited about Web3, whatever, but just explain your piece in the context of what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah, so I used to be my first job as a reporter was as a ad trade reporter covering advertising technology for a magazine called Ad Age. And whenever we used to be on the phone with someone who wanted to share news with us, they'd be like, "Why am I going to give it to you? You're tiny." And our perspective was always listen, the internet is one big newspaper that everybody reads. So if you give it to us, we're going to do a good job with this story. And it's going to be better than if you try to spray and pray and get a bunch of half-assed stories across the web, because eventually the news will find its audience. Yep. And that was in the early 2010s. I don't think that applies anymore. I think right now we're living in an internet that's not one big internet, but an internet of internet, or a community of communities that often don't overlap. And I think what we've seen is a few things. One is an explosion of content, Where like before, like if there was a funny college humor video or there was a funny YouTube video,
so viral.
Everyone's going to see
Will
it.
Ferrell getting evicting the child. Everyone saw
Right.
that back in
Hey,
2010.
where's my money?
yeah, everyone remembers that.
Exactly. But that doesn't, I just don't think that exists anymore because we just have so much more content on the internet coming from publications, passion publications, podcasts, brand publications, Substacks, the whole thing. And so it's really tough to have something that resonates across the whole internet anymore. Once you have that, you also have social media algorithms that have now really, there used to be this concept of the filter bubble. There really wasn't this filter bubble when it was talked about back then. But since then, Twitter's algorithms only existed.
Could you explain that?
Filter bubble is an algorithm. Basically, you could live in a bubble that's filtered by algorithms where like you would only see things that, appeal to your perspective and other people will see things that appeal to their perspective, whether you're, liberal or conservative, libertarian, woke, you have a certain interest in a sports team or something. You can literally live in an internet that's only showing you the stuff you want to see and the stuff, in your community. And before that used to be overblown. But, Twitter's algorithm, again, was only implemented in 2015. And we're 6 years in now. And that concept of the filter bubble really does exist. And it exists even more so. Not, when you combine the algorithm with the explosion of content, you can actually be like living in this bubble of content, not like the internet where you're going to see anything that's interesting. And then lastly, I think the rise of paywalls, which has really only happened in the past couple of years, means that an interesting idea on one publication won't necessarily spread to another publication. And so then therefore you could never be exposed to it. And there used to be a concept, and it still exists, but in a much lesser format called aggregation, where like if the New York Times would have a story, every other publication would, write 3 paragraphs and, you could read it anywhere. But that really doesn't exist anymore because every place has a paywall, even Business Insider, which started its whole, business on aggregation.
Stupid slideshows.
Yeah, exactly. Now they have a paywall. And so they don't give a shit about aggregating the New York Times anymore. They're making money from their readers and they're actually producing amazing journalism now. I mean, they're an unbelievable story. In some ways, okay, not everywhere,
No,
God.
This
isn't a Dave. Like
I wasn't talking about the Barstool thing.
Yeah,
now I stepped in and shit.
No, you got it. You got it. There's it's a huge company. There's different parts.
I'm not going to define.
They have done some good stories.
Right. I'm not going to define a publication based off of one story. So
more what I was trying to wanted to get with you as we get to the end here is I remember the optimism of the 2005 internet. And that may sound really weird, maybe to people who are younger, but in the midst of the chaos of the Iraq War, there was also just this inevitable, awesome discovery of the anonymity of the internet on the boards. And if you didn't live through it, I actually feel bad for people who didn't, because there was this recognition that like 4chan, while also being terrible, could also like vote and rig a poll, right? Remember Bodie McBoatface, stuff like that? That was a little bit later on. But that kind of was...
Kim Jong-un was every single year one of the People of the Year, Times People of the Year.
Exactly.
And obviously it's like not Kim Jong-un, but it's just like showing you how ridiculous that fucking thing is.
Yeah, it was really fun. There was like a real fun aspect to the power of the anonymity of the internet. I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I used to create a lot of rage comics back in the day. Actually,
Reddit Sagar. Reddit
American
Sagar.
I think I had over 100K karma on Reddit back in the day. Anyway, more what I'm getting at is that there was a lot of fun in that type of internet, which just seems to have completely disappeared. Do you think that that's part of what is reflected in what you're talking about? I've just been thinking a lot about what the internet used to be and kind of what it is now. It just seems a lot more miserable these days.
Yeah, it's sort of the inevitable cycle of tech, where like tech is initially like sticking it to the man. There are systems out there that are bullshit, run by bullshit people. Let's destroy them, right? And that was what was amazing about the internet. Okay, that boat's now named Bodie McBoatface. Kim Jong-un is the person of the year. But what happens is with scale, these things eventually start to resemble the institutions they were trying to take down. And, you end up in this cycle where they become just almost just as bad as the stuff they were trying to break. Because that's an inevitable feature of something that has scale and power is, it resembles the scale and power that it was trying to to smash in the face before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I do think that we're starting to see some of that, be lost. And the idea that like the internet isn't flat anymore, it's an internet of internets. Well, it's sort of like, well, the world wasn't really flat before. It was, siloed and tough to break into, and stuff didn't spread. And, we're starting to see that again.
I think this is great because this is a perfect pivot to our last bit here, which is there's certain parts of the audience who get mad when we talk about Web3 because they don't see it as political. And I think we notice this because we actually live in these technology spaces, whether or not NFTs, different DAOs, all these different things are the future. As people who deal in narratives in terms of us operating in the journalism space, there is very clearly a new narrative that's happening when it comes to like forward-thinking tech cycles. So the same people who were, let's say, writing software is eating the world about how Uber and Airbnb were going to be a big deal in 2008, 2010, they are now saying like Web3 is the next big thing. And something that's just interesting to me is how we're resetting these narratives and how these narratives will go wrong in a different way. And I just want to give you a quick example of this, Alex, and just get your thought, because this is a space we're going to do more with, and I'm sure you will too as well. We had the Constitution DAO episode talking about how, the ownership and the blockchain and everything. And I heard a founder in this space talking about how, in the future, we're going to see how Web3 and technology is going to make everything much more meritocratic. We're going to live in a world where like an 8-year-old will like get tasks on the blockchain, and they're going to complete these tasks and they're going to get paid in Ethereum or something like that. And then once they get paid, they're going to have this permanent record, and then they could like drop out of high school, or they can go to skip college because they'll have this permanent record. And the thing I was thinking about, and that's why it's important to like stop these narratives before they go too far. This was a big mistake during, I think, the last era of journalism, where I'm like, hey, here's another way of putting how shitty this is. Aside from just like 8-year-olds working jobs, because I don't think anyone would want that for their actual children. Imagine if the grades you got when you were in 3rd grade were permanent and always just existing. No one actually wants that in that context. And this is once again a founder who's very well funded, doing really interesting work. I think the product they're going to build is a good product in the same way that Airbnb was a good product. But I'm just interested, Alex, in closing here, how are you thinking of us resetting these new narratives? Because the thing a lot of these Web3 people will say is, we made all these mistakes during Web 2. We gave too much power to Mark Zuckerberg. So this time we're doing it differently. And I'm just already seeing, as someone who's interested in Web 3 and crypto, Sagar as well, those initial mistakes getting made here. So how do you think just about covering these spaces in a way that's not just Luddite? It's not just you saying, oh, like Bitcoin's bullshit or blockchain is bullshit. I hate when people say that's what critics are doing, because that's like disingenuous. But how do you just think about this?
It's so challenging because there is so much hype, and you see the problems in our society, problems like inequality, problems like centralization of power in the companies I cover, especially. A lot of this is a reaction to the power of Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, what's left for everybody else. And you see Web3, which has the potential to decentralize, potential to bring everybody in on the rewards and not concentrate them in the hands of a few. And you want to believe in it. I think the key is, whether you're writing about it or reading about it or listening to stuff about it, is the show don't tell part, right? Where it's so easy to get caught up in the vision. But one of the drawbacks is we haven't seen a lot of stuff actually done in practice. I mean, even the Constitution DAO, right? They raised all that money. They didn't buy the Constitution. They got outbid. So like, let's see it happen. By Ken Griffin, right? By the way, I mean, and I don't know.
He's such a troll. I love it.
He's a troll.
I love that.
It was a boss
honestly,
move.
like, it's so funny.
If I was a multi-billionaire, I would have done something the same.
If you're a believer in the system, that money is well spent, right? Because if the Constitution DAO bought the Constitution, which by the way doesn't give them the opportunity to amend it, it's just the document. But anyway, story for another time. But you would have just seen more and more momentum build around these type of things, which could be scary for people who, depend on the system to, prop them up, prop their wealth. But I think ultimately, the question that I hear smart people asking about this stuff is, we see the vision, show me how you're implementing it in practice. What software has been built on the blockchain? What actual practical applications have been built on Web3? That actually have something that can be used by the masses. When we start to see that stuff, that's when it's time to get excited. I don't think there's been enough of it to really start jumping up and down on the table about this revolution, quote unquote, which is why I haven't yet, but I'm waiting for it. And maybe it's going to take, like with Twitter, we knew Twitter, there was something amazing about Twitter the night that Osama bin Laden was killed, and some guy in Abbottabad was tweeting about it, and we found out before anybody else.
And a quick thing on this.
Yeah.
What I think all of us are searching for is a Mark Zuckerberg, separate everything that happens. I remember where I was when I first saw Facebook. I was at debate camp. This person said, hey, here's this thing. It's like MySpace, but it's not sketchy. Instant. No one had to say, here's Mark Zuckerberg's vision for how Web 1 was weak.
Exactly,
and Web 2 is going to let you to write. And Web 1, no, he was just like, hey, like, what if this was good? And I'm like, cool. That's what people are looking for. And that's the founder who I think is going to make, that's the non-grifty, non-speculative billionaire, maybe even trillionaire who comes from Web3. They will just show us something cool and we'll say awesome and do it.
I've been thinking about the same thing. You know, I just listened to Kevin Systrom on Lex Friedman's podcast. It's actually pretty interesting to go back and think about, which is that
Instagram founder, right?
The founder of Instagram, which is like, look, you know, if you have to say it, then it's just not what it is. The iPhone, like as people even pointed out at the time, 2007, there were a lot of touchscreen phones. They just like, they were a piece of shit, right? They were hard to use, didn't work properly, not intuitive. And then the iPhone just create, boom, platform. That's what Ethereum and the blockchain don't have right now, which is that, look, I bought my Ethereum domain and it cost me $300 in gas fees. Like, it was fine. Actually, funny story, I ended up buying some Ethereum like 3 years ago. So it's actually worth a ton more. Then I forgot about it completely until I logged in order to buy this domain. But I was like, yeah, this just isn't it. I was like, you know, I had to figure connect wallet and then this. I was like, no, the ease of use here is a disaster. We're probably 5 years away from this becoming anything even remotely close to what a technology literate person will be able to use on the average. And then you extrapolate that out even more in terms of what the, you know, iPhone level type consumer will be able to use. So I've been thinking about it in that time scale. And I think you're putting it really well too, which is like, show us, don't tell us, you know, like if you just stop with the hype, actually show us how it can actually be used. I'm not hating on a lot of the stuff that I see out there. I just don't see.
It's a call to action.
I remember I was 14 years old and somebody was like, yeah, Facebook's all about networks. You can see other people in high school. I was like, oh, cool.
Use your high school email address. Use your Harvard. Like that was, boom. That's the social network moment. And that's what I think we in good faith actually want to see, because and Sagar, you actually have a time limit. So if we need to extend for 2 minutes, that's okay. If you need to go, because this is actually just so important, Alex. All I like, the thing that's interesting to me is that I have not seen that many creators like us go all in on like Web3 stuff. Like we're not minting NFTs to sell to our audiences. We're not creating like a Realignment or big technology media DAO. And the reason why basically no one is doing it is because we don't want to speculate. Like we know we could like make money. Like we could all make, like Sagar, if you and Crystal had minted an NFT when you launched Breaking Points, you guys could have made a lot of money. But like you don't, but because you're actually a good, trustworthy person, you're not going to try to speculate. Like you can't, like the thing for us is like, if we're, and Alex, this is so important because I love when you were talking about this with newsletters. This is a 5-year bet, what we are doing here. And if you grift too hard or you speculate too hard or you tell people there's value in this thing and then you sell and pull the bag, we're screwed. And if anyone is in Web3 and they're working on this, we know you're listening right now. Please convince us that you have something that makes me say with the honesty and excitement of the person who said, hey, use your Lake Oswego High School email address to get into this Facebook. It's super chill. I want to be able to tell that to our audience members. I want us to have a conversion of that. I want us to not have to give this and Alex, please reflect. I know I'm ranting here, but I just get excited. Like if I hear one more Web3 person say, everyone is tired of the power that Mark Zuckerberg wields over these platforms, they want something new. I'm like, that's an ideological point. That's not like a business argument. Sorry,
so I have to jump, but let me just tell this story. And this is a good example because I actually literally have to do a business, you know, and all of this, which is that I was searching for a problem that I had. I wanted to launch the show Breaking Points with Crystal. And Marshall and I were talking about what's the best way to actually launch that show and to get premium subscriptions with the model. Marshall told me about Supercast. It was like, oh, you just put a link, then it generates a premium feed, sends up to the people, takes a modest fee per subscriber, and also manages your email. I was like, oh, see, they just solved an actual problem for me. And I signed up for them. And we've had a very fortuitous business relationship. There's no problem being solved yet. Like every time I see them come forward, I'm like, yeah, you can have a community. I'm like, I can do that already. Like I already have one. You know, like you're not solving an actual problem for anything that I actually have right now. And until you do, it sounds cool. Definitely recognize that it's the next platform on which something will be built. But without that, you know, I don't see any real practical application. So that's I'm really sorry. I have to jump right off, guys. But
yeah, Alex, let's get your closing thoughts.
Show, don't tell. It's an economy that the only thing matters is trust. And Web3 has the opportunity to build trust back into the economy. Don't fuck it up. Don't fuck it up.
Yep.
Show, don't tell. Build the applications that make this happen. And everybody will be thrilled to jump in. But we need to see it in action.
Do not make my 8-year-old code all day. No one wants that.
Exactly. Not interested.
Alex, thank you so much for joining. This is really great. A lot of really great topics here. Can you just shout out the newsletter, the book, the podcast, all the good stuff?
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, first of all. First thing I'll say is, everybody, appreciate you listening. Go rate Realignment 5 stars. Now, in terms of the stuff that I do, Big Technology Podcast is the place that I direct folks to. We run it once a week, every Wednesday. It's a show with conversations with tech insiders and outside agitators. And if you like it, please subscribe. Otherwise, I have a newsletter, Big Technology. It's on Substack, and the book is always day one.
Good show. All right. Thanks, Ben. Have a good rest
Thanks,
of your
Marshall.
day.
All right. It's a pleasure.